Hey guys, it's Villain Theory. Been a while. Hope everyone's had a great new year, good holidays, all that stuff. I'm back and I'm excited to talk about the X-Men. About a year ago, I did a video looking, back at the X-Force, but I wasn't, making videos when the original X-Men expansion, Mutant Genesis, and subsequent hero packs and scenario pack, Mojo Mania, were released. I didn't cover those in great detail. And Age of Apocalypse, that kind of wave has just finished with Magneto. We've got the 4 hero packs and obviously the expansion box. The twist here is that I've done quite a lot of videos recently, looking at heroes in terms of what I enjoy the most, villains, difficulty, all these different things. And I've talked about all these things that we're going to look at quite a lot already in the last few months. So I want to do something a bit different. And rather than talk about how fun they are, I'm going to do that a bit, or how powerful they are specifically. I want to focus on what did they bring to the game that was new, that was different, what have they provided? And this will focus on the heroes and villains predominantly. I'll talk about the modular sets a little bit, aspects a little bit, but I think I might do a separate video for the aspects about what the mutant waves have brought to the game in general in terms of deck building. So stay tuned for that. So let's get into it with the villains. First of all, I want to talk about these 4 villains from the Mutant Genesis wave. The first 3 are all from Mutant Genesis itself, whereas Magog is from the Mojo Mania scenario pack. Now, what I think these villains really started bringing to the game, which maybe started with Sinister Motives just before it, but really, these are villains which reward defending. Now, some of these you can still chump block, some of them you can still stun, but overall, they're just making you deal with their attacks in slightly different ways, with slightly different meaning. I think there's a really interesting change. But there is a small problem here. Sabretooth, I'm not a huge fan of because he also heals while you're having to make sure you're defending. It's just slowing you down from a couple of bits. I don't think mechanically the different parts of his scenario gel too well. It feels a little bit like they ticked, the right boxes. For the story, got to rescue the senator, you got to protect him. Sabretooth heals, so yeah, we'll make him heal. But it doesn't feel super fun to me personally. And they put in the Mystique mod set. Something else I did in my recent videos is, talk about the villains, without their recommended mod sets because you can, and I would say often should, change them up for variety and also different fun. The Mystique mod set is terrible. Do not play Sabretooth with the Mystique mod set if you value having fun. That is my opinion. Uh, I'm not going to say there isn't fun to be had there, but I think there's lots and lots more fun to be had elsewhere without some frustrations. You know, if you don't have a support or an ally out, some of the cards in that Mystique mod set will just lose you the game because they delete Robert Kelly and that's game over. Not a huge fan of Sabretooth, but the way he started, bringing sort of defending someone into the game as more of a concept. Sabretooth walked so more like Siege could run. Project Wide Awake, with the Sentinel here, they take away your allies if you defend with them. It's a little bit like Collector, but way better. With that said, I don't. Oh, it just feels a little bit restrictive somehow to me. In combination with the Ultra Ego threshold is very low for something bad to happen. So I mainly play 2-player, but playing this on solo is not as good of an experience as any of the other player counts, in my opinion. So it's got some ups and downs. Really thematic. 10 out of 10 for theme. Mechanically, both Sabretooth and Sentinel, and actually Master Mod, which we'll talk about soon, provide scenario-specific allies. Which I have a few little issues with. They mess up any kind of team kind of trait stuff you're trying to do. And Project Wide Awake is the least intrusive of these, followed by Sabretooth. But it's just it didn't click with me. But a lot of people love Project Wide Awake, and I will say for theme, it's absolutely incredible. And this might sound a bit negative, but these first 3 we're talking about here are the villains I like the least from all the X-Men villains. It's all uphill from there, and there are some of my favorite villains in the game. In fact, I might say 2 or 3 of my top 5 villains are, X-Men villains here. So there's a lot of great stuff, but the first 2 villains didn't click with me. Neither did Master Mold, who, when you go Ultra Ego and, he schemes, whenever he schemes in general, you basically get a Sentinel minion. It just feels very punishing, and I don't feel like going Ultra Ego is something that needs to be punished any more than it already is, notably in solo play. So that's just kind of a little markdown for me. I don't know if the way the encounter cards are significantly, exciting me in any way that the Sentinel, Project Wide Awake ones aren't. They are a bit different. There's more upgrades and things going on. But, it is what it is. And you have Magneto with you from the campaign. Even in standalone play, you have to have campaign Magneto as an ally there helping you. And it just feels really weird and a bit wonky. He's very, very helpful. Maybe too helpful. There are harder scenarios in, let's say, Age of Apocalypse that don't give you a Magneto to help. So it just feels a little bit strange and weird. Quite often when I play Master Mode, I try not to use Magneto, but it's just me ignoring part of the scenario that I should really be using. So, it's kind of hard to rate it like that and just say, oh, just don't use it. Because then I'm recommending you play it ignoring or not using a part that you are meant to kind of use. It's kind of odd to me. So thematically, I do think Master Mod's pretty good as well. Thematically, all four of these are really good, but the first three just didn't quite click with me in all the right ways. Have a couple of elements I'm not a huge fan of, especially Sabretooth and Master Mold. Magog, however, I love fighting Magog. Magog is one of my favorite villains in the game, and he is just so different. And whoever gets the crowd cheering, to a certain point first wins here. So it's very different to get the hit points to 0. You're trying to stop the scheme going over. You're trying to defeat side schemes, remove attachments, defeat the surprise contender. All these different ways to get the crowd cheering for you. Meanwhile, Magog is trying to get the crowd cheering for him. But damaging him, damaging minions, removing side schemes and threat, all these things still kind of contribute, but they just play out a little bit differently. So sometimes when a scenario, a villain in the game is a little bit maybe, gimmicky, a little bit different, it can kind of feel a bit, strange. But with Magog, everything still works. It's not like, oh, I've got all these attacks and they don't work or the values don't make sense. He's different, but it's all still good and it's just phenomenal. So I think some of the changes that, Mutant Genesis brought in, maybe really continuing from Sinister Motives a little bit with, like Sandman and maybe Venom a little bit, it's just prioritizing defense as being something more meaningful. That's really cool to see. Age of Apocalypse actually kind of continued this, and so we're going to continue this talk. Unus comes in with the Infinites modular set as mandatory, has the gene pool, and that basically means if you block with allies, Threat gets added onto gene pool. If Threat is on gene pool, lots and lots of his cards become quite nasty, including his villain card. He gets Retaliate if there's a certain amount, then if there's even more Stow, and if there's even more Amplify. I think the downside for this scenario is it can be quite a lot to keep track of, quite a lot of moving parts for not as much gain as maybe you'd hope for doing that. You have to keep track of gene pool, putting threat here and there, and then looking at all these cards back to gene pool. It's not a big deal, but I think once you hit like 3 and 4 players, it can be a little bit fiddly. But overall, a very solid scenario, although the Infinites modular set, which can be put elsewhere, is doing all the heavy lifting. This scenario is basically all around that modular set and just enhancing it, but you could just take that modular set to an existing scenario that has all sorts of other fun in it, and then get most of the fun out of that mod set anyway. So I don't find myself playing Unus too much, but I do still think it's a very solid scenario. Apocalypse is interesting. Most of his villain stages have steady, and he has, with the recommended set, the Infinites, which again, you don't want to block with allies or add threat onto there, and then the minions in that set will become mean. So he kind of says, you can't really stun or confuse me very easily, and you shouldn't be blocking with allies, and I'm going to hit like a truck. So he really does challenge you, and if I had to, I mean, I kind of feel like if they're going to punish you for blocking with allies, they shouldn't punish, status cards. They should give you some kind of avenue, because not all characters can just take the damage and deal with it. But, it is what it is. The infinite set is changeable, and that's typically what I like to do, though it will depend. I have for him mostly with that set, so it feels almost like cheating if I let myself block with allies, consequence free against him. But I don't think that's a healthy mindset. I think you can and should change it as you like. Now, I'm going to come back to talk more about Apocalypse in general. I just really wanted to highlight how he rewards, defending with your hero or, damage blocking cards as opposed to chump blocking or even status cards. Kind of similar for Apocalypse, who, we've got 2 Apocalypses here, but these are actually from 2 different scenarios. The first one we just looked at with Steady is from the actual Apocalypse scenario, and this other Apocalypse is from N7. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And this guy has Overkill, which also means maybe you don't want to block with allies, but he also has a different form. He's like the Ant-Man of villains. He has a folding card where he has Stalwart, which means your status cards aren't going to be working, pushing you toward defending differently than most scenarios do. So out of 13 villains between these 2 waves we're looking at, 7 of them really reward defending or, mitigating damage in different ways to sort of normal, and that's kind of interesting. I kind of like that. So out of, I think, 13 total villains between, these 2 expansions and scenario pack we're looking at, 7 of them really affect the way you want to mitigate damage. They really, overall, reward your hero just being able to defend more than usual. So that's kind of interesting, and I wanted to highlight that. Speaking of Apocalypse and Apocalypse, I want to keep these in mind as we talk about what I consider the final villains of the box. So we've got Magneto from Mutant Genesis, and when he came out, I was like, this is the best final villain we have. And to some degree, I still believe that. In the new box, in Age of Apocalypse, I say new, we're about to get Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but in the latest box, N7 is the final villain, and this version of Apocalypse It's probably very slightly my favorite over Magneto. I just really like playing N7. It's super, super fun. But it doesn't feel as much like a final villain, like a final boss. So I think in some ways Magneto is a better final boss, but N7 is a more fun scenario. But I really love both of them. And, it can depend what I'm looking for at the time. They're both absolutely solid scenarios. Magneto will test you on every front, very high tempo. You can get rid of his steady that's printed on his card through a scenario effect. He kind of has a series of side schemes a bit like Hela. So does actually Apocalypse from the Apocalypse scenario, which we're going to come back to. Uh, so that's kind of interesting. It's very epic and very fun. Now, why I've left Apocalypse here from the Apocalypse scenario, the third scenario in the Age of Apocalypse box, is because he kind of feels like a final villain, even though he isn't the final villain. So he's a better final villain than the final villain in his box, I'd say, even if the final villain in his box is a better overall villain. Hopefully you guys are with me. Apocalypse, the third one from the Age of Apocalypse box, is what I would say is basically Hela from the Mad Titan's Shadow expansion, improved in almost every way. I am an absolutely huge fan of this scenario. It feels epic. You have to work through these different side schemes, different, lieutenants are jumping out trying to stop you. It's got some interesting stuff going on in terms of, defeating him, resets the threat, removes attachments. It's, very much from the Hela playbook, but rather than with Hela, if you hang on to the first side scheme, you can kind of game it, play around it, and makes it kind of easy. With Apocalypse here, it kind of feels almost like it's designed for you to take advantage of that and deal with it. Like everything feels paired up already. It's almost like you have to do that to have a good chance against it. I mean, you can go a little bit faster. It depends on the difficulty and the heroes you have. Uh, but nonetheless, very, very fun design. So I prefer N7 Apocalypse as my favorite, closely followed by Magneto, and not as closely followed, but still a very, very enjoyable scenario. The regular Apocalypse scenario after that. Uh, really, really fun regardless. I think if you're looking for quite a good challenge or brawl, these are some great choices. I do think Magneto might be a little bit too difficult than what the average player is often looking for. But if you are looking for something difficult, he is so fun. He definitely allows a lot more flexibility and, you don't have to optimize as much as, let's say, Expert Venom Goblin or Ronin are going to demand from you. Then I want to talk about what are often called the multi-villain scenarios. We've got Mansion Attack, which I actually don't think is a multi-villain scenario. Yes, there are multiple potential villains, but there are never more than one out at once. This is what I've started calling a dynamic villain scenario. The villain changes, but there's only ever one out at a time. And then we've got Four Horsemen, where all four start out on the board, very much like Wrecking Crew, of which I think it's quite a big direct evolution from. I've got an evolution to villains video. I think if you check that out, you'll see that it's actually a really close evolution, but they basically took all the good and got rid of all the bad. So you've got Mansion Attack. There is a stack of villains, you work through. You don't know who's going to be the next one. And you also have different main schemes, which have different effects. So you've got all this sort of, variety, different kind of experience each time, because you have different villains and a different main scheme out. And that can be sometimes not too bad, sometimes very painful. You never quite know what you're going to get. So it's very, very replayable. The big downside is if we're talking recommended mod sets, it recommends Mystique. My recommendation is no Mystique. Get rid of Mystique. Don't put Mystique near the scenario. It's not as bad as in Sabretooth, but nonetheless, I think, just put any other mod set that comes in the box in here, and basically it'll be better for the most part. But yeah, I do like this scenario quite a bit, even if you get unlucky with the sort of villain and main scheme combination, it can feel quite nasty. Four Horsemen is just like the best multi-villain scenario in the game, in my opinion. There's not like a huge amount of true multi-villain scenarios, but it just has all the good of Wrecking Crew, none of the bad. The villains don't overstay their welcome. They are still, each villain is very distinct here. They each have this sort of new ability, which kind of came from the Wrecking Crew side schemes, now onto the villain cards directly. They're just fun. If I had to criticize it, it could be quite a lot to track the activations in multiplayer, especially, and a couple of the effects are quite disruptive. So if you have a specific game plan, it might not, come to fruition as you hoped. But it's still really, really fun. Surprisingly difficult for the second villain in the box, and I enjoy them quite a lot. The final villains are kind of the ones I have left over. Two from the Mojo Mania box. Magog is there, then it's Spiral, then Mojo, and something that Magog has that I probably should have mentioned, which Spyro and Mojo also have, is you're kind of in a race to defeat them, which might sound a little bit strange. There's no kind of like Doom mechanic like Arkham, but the game is going to end if you don't end it. So with Magog, if you don't get counters fast enough, you can't remove them. So if the villain keeps getting them, they will win. Spyro, you can kind of keep going, but you're going to need a lot of thwarting to do it. Generally, I would see the main scheme as almost like a timer, and you can lower it a little bit, but you will gradually lose to threat in a lot of cases. So it really does incentivize you to keep going. The more you can get done before Spiral gets her swords, the better. She's kind of like the new Norman Osborn risky business from the Green Goblin scenario pack. There's two different sides to her, and you want to try and bring out, she's hidden. You want to try and find her, corner her, and then do as much damage as you can before she disappears. A bit like, you want to deal as much damage to Green Goblin before he goes back to Norman Osborn. Uh, really well done. I think it likes a bit of a variety, and the tempo's a bit strange. I can have all these cards to deal damage, but if there's not many minions around, I can't hit Spiral because she's hidden. I need to try and corner her. So I don't reach for this one all the time, but I do like it. I think if you play the game occasionally, you get a lot more value than if you play it repeatedly. I don't think she's, some villains I feel like I can play 5 times back to back. Spiral, I'll play every so often, if that makes sense. Mojo's kind of similar. There's quite a bit of setup, quite a few mod sets you need to get out. But he's really fun. He's going to kind of really pressure you on the threat. It kind of feels like a timer as well. But if you don't lose the threat, you will probably lose to him running out of mod sets. You progressively add mod sets to him as he goes, and if he runs out, you lose. So that's kind of an interesting thing. You kind of have to go quite fast. You can see he's got one attack, free scheme, starting here on Expert, which is pretty crazy. So threat is really a big thing here. I enjoy him. He's very different. Again, I probably won't play him 5 times in a row, but I would play him, every so often, but a bit more than Spiral. Dark Beast is on the kind of opposite of Spiral and Mojo, whereas he's quite normal. It feels like he could have been in like the previous couple of expansions. It doesn't feel like he's a cutting edge modern villain, even though he comes in Age of Apocalypse, but not in a bad way. He doesn't feel outdated, but he just feels kind of normal, but a really good normal, really playable. I feel like I can slap him down, take any hero, any kind of aspect up against him, and I'm probably going to really enjoy it. And I really like that. He's kind of, very inspired by Mr. Sinister. It kind of feels like with the way he has different environments coming. It almost feels like Mr. Sinister's getting different attachments. But when a new environment comes in, it swaps out the old one. He also does bring in mod sets as well. So I guess he's a little bit like Mojo here. But yeah, Dark Beast, very, very playable. Not too difficult, but not as easy as I think I've had some people say. I feel like, he's got a couple of dangerous things where, he gets extra boost cards on an activation and so on and so forth. But a big fan of him. If I had to rank them, I'd do something like this. Master Mold and Sabretooth, unfortunately, last, followed by Mansion Attack and Project Wide Awake. Mansion Attack would be, honestly, like 2 to 4 spots higher, I'd say. If it wasn't for Mystique, I'm rating them here with the recommended set, but you can definitely improve Mansion Attack and Sabretooth by not using her. Then we've got Spiral and Unis. Again, also maybe Mojo above. I'm not reaching for these ones all the time, but they are interesting, particularly Mojo and Spiral. And we've got Apocalypse. I think without Infinites, probably moves up to the next couple, but nonetheless, a very, very good scenario. Really a fun kind of epic scenario. 4 Horsemen, my favorite multi-villain scenario in the game. Dark Beast, supreme playable. And I talked a lot about Magog already. I talked a lot about Magneto and N7. Just really fun. On Expert mode, quite challenging. I probably should say Magog, Mojo, Spiral. The Mojo Mania scenarios on Expert is significantly harder than their standard counterparts. So people on standard probably thinking, Magog's super easy. On Expert, he can actually be a significant challenge. It depends on the makeup of your deck. If you can stun a lot, if you have, lots of toughs, you're probably going to destroy him because, again, he rewards not taking damage, which is a theme we've seen throughout. Then we have the modular set. So I'm just going to talk about my favorites. I put S+, SA. These tiers don't really mean anything, but these are just to show which I think are the best and which I think are, still really good from these boxes. There's a lot more sets here that I could have included. There's like, 8 hero packs out of the 10 we have between these two waves, which also came with their own modular set. There's so many, but these were the ones I think are best. I don't know if Standard 3 is really a modular set in a traditional sense, but it is modular in terms of you can swap it with Standard in basically all the scenarios, and it's incredibly good. I've got videos basically just about Standard 3 on my channel. I love Standard 3. I use it all the time at 1 and 2 player, at least like 70 to 80% of the time, whereas in 3 to 4 player, I tend towards Standard 1 more, but there's still, it's still perfectly good there. It's very, very fun. It changes the way that your Nemesis enters play, and that is a significant change that I think, it affects every hero in different ways. Some get hit harder than others. And I just love that they're, a new standard set. I didn't know we were ever going to get one again after Standard 2 wasn't maybe the most popular, but I kind of feel like now every expansion should come with a new standard set. We'll see. I don't think that's going to happen in, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but I'd love it if it did. S tier, it's got some permanent and set up, Modulars, which bring something in immediately on turn 1. That's going to affect the game. I love that. It's got some teamwork modular sets. That's a new keyword that came in Mutant Genesis. Acolytes, Blue Moon, and Reavers, I think, are the best teamwork modular sets in the game. What I think sets them apart is that even if the teamwork keyword doesn't trigger, the minions are still interesting. They're not just going to sit there and be these sort of, uh, I don't know, meat bags, these kind of, whack-a-mole things that, you just get rid of their health. They didn't do anything because they didn't trigger, teamwork didn't happen. They have lots of other interesting stuff on them. And then we've got Arcade, which I think some people would be surprised to see here. This is from Jubilee's Hero Pack. It has side schemes, and they're not too difficult, but they are fun. They all have an effect beyond just, removing the threat. So if I'm looking for something that's maybe a little bit more chill than a state of emergency, but still going to add more side schemes to a scenario without too much else interfering, I actually love that. I think that fills in a really good slot. I really enjoy that one. So yeah, I was surprised to see it here too. A lot of the other ones we've got on here are from Mojo Mania. They're all really good, especially fantasy and horror. Future Past from Mutant Genesis, really good high difficulty modular set. Most people, it's probably too difficult to include very often at all. But if you do want to make things more difficult, it's so good. Then we've just got Infinite Inertia, again, a bit like Savage Land, Blue Moon, Kanakaba. These have permanent and or like setup cards, which just change the scenario from turn 1, which are really, really good. I've got other videos where I talk about these more. Go check that out. But generally, getting Mojo Mania and Age of Apocalypse is going to upgrade your modular set game significantly. If you'd like to change them up, or maybe you're considering it, these will make a big, big difference. Now let's talk about heroes. First of all, I want to talk about what I see as the defensive heroes from the X-Men waves. We've got Shadowcat, Iceman, and Nightcrawler. If you like to play protection and defend, these are going to be your characters. I personally don't, so maybe Iceman and Nightcrawler were never going to be loved by me. Shadowcat has a lot to do with attacking. She has a form change card with, solid and phased on the other side, and in solid form, she gets a resource that can help pay for attacks, and I really like to do that. You can do some really great aggression builds with her. Also, with all these characters, to be honest, I think you can play all these characters in any aspect, even if protection is generally seen as their go-to, to some degree at least. I personally, yeah, just really favor Shadowcat. She feels more dynamic. I feel like I can do a lot more with her. I would say she's also more powerful, and it's difficult to say, oh, being powerful makes them better. But Iceman and Nightcrawler both frustrate me. If you see my hero reviews for them, they just have something slightly frustrating about them, something slightly awkward, whereas Shadowcat doesn't feel awkward and you feel a bit more in control of your own destiny. Like, oh, if I defend, I will change form. It just feels better in general. If I did have to be negative about Shadowcat, I don't like her Nemesis set, and I absolutely hate her obligation. It's probably my least favorite obligation in the game, right down there with like Ghost Spiders. There's probably more, but those are the ones that spring to mind. So that's slightly unfortunate, but she's still just incredibly fun, a really fun form changer, one of the best still. Iceman, I do want to say I love the Frostbite mechanic and idea. I just think his card is a little bit pricey, a little bit awkward and clunky kind of thing. No, oh, this is fun to work around, or I need to think about this. It's more on it's just doesn't really make me feel like a powerful superhero when I play Iceman. It kind of feels like I'm trying to navigate some awkwardness a lot of the time. It's the unfortunate truth there for me. Some people love him, some people don't like him as much, and I'm unfortunately in the latter category. Similar for Nightcrawler. Bamf is really fun. It's a card that's, a zero cost upgrade that goes on enemies and lets you defend without exhausting, which is really, really good. But his attack cards and, things that interact with it tend to be a little bit weird. So, yeah, that's kind of a shame. Nightcrawler was the X-Men I was looking forward to the most, but I have a lot of pleasant surprises who I weren't looking forward to that I really, really enjoyed to make up for it. So, for the defensive heroes, Shadowcat is the clear winner. But, if you like the other ones, that's good. Oh, and I should say Iceman and Nightcrawler both came from the Age of Apocalypse wave, whereas, Shadowcat Mutant Genesis was obviously, one of the first X-Men we got. Next up, we have what I'm calling the support heroes. We've got Cyclops and Storm, both from the Mutant Genesis wave, both from their own hero pack, both leadership hero packs. And they're both really, really fun and really, really powerful, as most support heroes tend to be in this game, like, you, Doctor Strange, maybe Cable. They can support others and do really good for themselves too. They can support themselves to greatness. But what these both have in common is that they can lower the villain's damage for the whole table. They can increase the damage everyone at the table is dealing. So they can both really affect things in different ways, just with their base kit. And both of them, because they increase, the damage all characters can do, they both have a lot of synergy with allies, especially Cyclops, who can take allies from other aspects. But you can also do Storm with readying rather than allies. There's lots of interesting avenues with these characters. They are really flexible. Cyclops has a whole thing going with tactics. So, you can go into attacking, into allies, into tactics for Cyclops. You can, Storm has a lot of options as well. Both of these are absolutely fantastic and some of my favorite heroes. Probably in the game, and definitely from the X-Men waves. So I think these are really good. Maybe they shouldn't be quite as strong. Cyclops' optic blast ability maybe doesn't look strong, but it's incredibly convenient, as our Storm. She has these 4 different weather supports she can switch between. She kind of has everything she needs at her fingertips from turn 1. Maybe it's a bit too strong, but it is incredibly fun, and I highly recommend them. Next up, I'm going to talk about what I see as kind of the attack event characters. Wolverine can spend his hit points to, pay for attack events. Gambit doesn't have anything special to pay for them, although he does have double resource cards in his hero kit. But he can spend counters to charge up his attack events to deal extra damage. That's really fun. Then there's Jubilee, who, she has her sunglass upgrade, which, rewards you for the custody attack card you played. But for me, Wolverine and Gambit, who are from Mutant Genesis, the wave, are a lot more fun and interesting than Jubilee, who's a little bit more generic and underwhelming to me. She can exhaust, generate a wild, generally less useful than having, 2 or 3 in one of the primary stats. But it is fine, but it kind of negates the fact that her cards want her to spend different resources. If you always have that, wild available, it kind of solves the challenge she's presenting for you all the time from turn 1. You always have that available. So, it's a little bit weird there. Her cards are kind of like, deal damage and stun, remove threat and confuse, which we've seen a few times more on that soon. Whereas I feel like Wolverine and Gambit are more interesting with Wolverine's, take damage mechanic. Gambit has this kind of form flipping thing going on. His kit is kind of split between hero form and alter ego, and his alter ego is probably like the best we have in the game in terms of fun. It's really sensational. I love it. Let's stick with Jubilee for a little bit. Not to be too negative, but we also have Rogue and Magic. Rogue came in the Mutant Genesis wave. Magic was actually in the Age of Apocalypse box, and these characters also have cards which deal damage and stun or remove threat and confuse. But Magic's, she doesn't always have the stun and confuse on them. She has to earn it by having the right resource type on top of her deck, and that's kind of more of an engaging challenge to me than Jubilee's, spend a different resource type. Rogue has to have Touched, which is an upgrade she can put on enemies or friendlies to get different benefits. She has to have that in the right place to get different effects, and that's also way more engaging to me. She also has, Rogue can do such interesting things with traits, but she doesn't even have to touch traits. She also has Superpower Adaptation, one of my favorite cards in the game. Superpower Adaptation is basically make the call for events. You can reach into another player's discard pile and get their event and play it. And it's so flexible, so fun in multiplayer, but she's still phenomenal in solo play. She just gets even better in multiplayer. Magic gets to look at the top card of her deck, which is, crazily changes up the game and how you're playing things. She's maybe a little bit too strong too. She gets a lot of, being able to play the top card of her deck, which is what the rest of her text then says. It's kind of like having a bigger hand size, and you get a discount on playing that card too. It's just, she can get a lot of stuff done. And she's got the Mystic trait, as well as the X-Men trait. Very, very engaging playstyle. Maybe a little more complicated than most characters. So some people might bounce off it, but if you like that kind of thing, which I do, very reminiscent of Domino from the Next Evolution expansion. And Jubilee just feels like, she's missing something spicy to add on top of this. Yeah, I can, damage and stun as well, but I wish there was something a little bit more going on with her. And, some people would argue I should put her with the support characters because her side scheme, she has Shopping Spree, can get other characters in the game, item upgrades. But I would say she's more of a event-driven character who just has one kind of support element in her kit. Jubilee does have somewhere I think she does really shine. I mean, I do enjoy her in basically all the aspects in like solo and 2-player, but there's probably other characters I'd rather be playing, with the X-Men trait, doing the same kind of, attack kind of thing, or even the forwarding thing. But taking to 3 and 4-player, I think she's very, very good at focus forwarding there. If she decides to be, really good at forwarding, she is absolutely phenomenal at it. And maybe she can focus on that a little bit better than most characters, even if her base power isn't, super high. She is particularly good at that, so I do like that. But going outside of the X-Men, if I want to do, multiplayer forwarding, I don't know if I pick her over like Miss Marvel or, any kind of event-driven character really, or only, the heavy forwarders. Not in terms of power, but just in terms of what's going on, in terms of interestingness. It's kind of how I feel, but she's fine, but she has a lot of competition, if that makes sense. So don't mean to talk too much down on Jubilee. I think she is a fun hero, but not as fun as many of the ones we have. Next up, we're having kind of like 2 of the tanky characters that aren't really based on wanting to defend at all here. We have Colossus and Bishop. Now, these are kind of polar opposites because Colossus has Tufts. Some games it's very rare he even takes damage on his hit points. It will depend on a deck. You can kind of even lean into it. Whereas Bishop wants to take damage and get rewarded for it. Colossus is really interesting. He gets a lot of Tufts, and he can spend them on his events to deal extra things, or some of his events don't even work unless you have one. And there's kind of an innate problem here, because if you make spending the tufts better than using the tufts to block damage, you're not going to want to block damage. And he's Colossus. He's the metal guy. He's meant to like take hits and power through. That's kind of the power fantasy there. But if his events are really good, you might want to protect your tufts. Oh, defend me! I don't want someone to hit me and take away one of my precious tough cards. Thematically, that is really weird, and that's actually what's kind of happened. I think the opposite would be the tough cards being, much more efficient for blocking. So, I don't want to use my events and spend them. I just, would rather do other stuff, ignore my hero kind of thing, and just use the tufts to take damage. So there's pros and cons either way. I think getting a perfect balance is nearly impossible. So I think they did a decent job with it, because it's still fine to take attacks, especially, with some of the protection cards that we got in the waves after Mutant Genesis, Next Evolution, and Age of Apocalypse. So I originally hated protection for him. I think it's doing a lot better now. But thematically, really weird, because thematically, you don't always want to be, using your tufts to block. You want to be spending them on your events and things. And you want to go Ultra Ego quite a lot, because he's a 2 size bigger hand, and he gets a tough when he flips back down. But mechanically, in terms of playing him, getting the most out of him, one of my favorites. He's got so many interesting decision points. What do I spend these tufts on? What order am I going to do things? His cards are really satisfying when you play them. So I love Colossus, but thematically, it's kind of weird. Bishop is kind of perfect thematically. He's very much an evolution of Captain Marvel. I did a video called The Evolution of Heroes where I talk about that specifically. She's got a card called Energy Absorption, which just has a bunch of resources on it. He's got an ability on his hero card called Energy Absorption, where you actually see him take damage, absorb the energy, and get the resources that way. When he takes damage, you discard, and any resources discarded, you get to keep. And he's got cards like his rifle and his uniform, which deal damage or heal you equal to the amount of resources you find, how many you've got in your hand. It's a really dynamic playstyle. It changes up the kind of equation on a lot of cards, which make you take damage. Things like Taunt, Toe to Toe. It's just interesting. It's really dynamic, and I absolutely love it. And I should note both of these characters come in their respective expansions of Mutant Genesis and Age of Apocalypse. Up next, we've got Phoenix and Magneto, who are kind of the weird heroes left over. I'm kind of categorizing these as the characters with quite a bit of money, some cards which are kind of awkward and undesirable to be in hand a lot of the time, but also quite like readying and value readying up quite a lot. So Phoenix has really good base stats. She can get free attack as well by changing her kind of form. It doesn't count as a form, but she goes from restrained to unleashed. That's kind of her that's her big mechanic. And she doesn't have as much innate readying as Magneto. She does have events which can do it, but they're a little bit pricey. But you can do it, and because she's got these big stats, she's really rewarded for readying up and using them. Magneto has only 2 fort, 2 attack, but he does have a card which lets him, increase those when he uses his magnetic pull action on his hero card, which we'll talk about in a moment. And he does have a cape which lets him ready up every turn. So that is really helpful for readying builds. Kind of incentivizes you to boost up his stats some more with aspect cards. So they both are pretty good at readying and basic stat focused builds. Phoenix has these power counters which he can generate extra money from. Also power of the mind nowadays. Magneto has his Master of Magnetism resource card and his magnetic pull ability, which is discard until you find a magnetic card. You get to add that to your hand. He just has extra cards in hand. He's really rich. So that's they both have a lot of money to throw around. They both have quite expensive cards, and Phoenix's cards, when she's restrained, quite a lot of her cards just aren't very good. So for a lot of the game, at least at the start of it, I'll be in restrained form, and I'll see a bunch of Phoenix cards in my hand, and I'll be like, wow, I wish I didn't have Phoenix cards in my hand. That's not a good look when you're playing a hero. But generally, she is really fun in Unleashed form. She has a ton of fun builds in the different aspects, and that's really good. So I definitely still like playing Phoenix. She just has a couple of downsides to note. Also, her nemesis, it's not the end of the world. In most scenarios, you can often overcome it, but it feels like it's way too harsh compared to the hero itself. I don't know why she has one that's that difficult. I think if they were going to do it, she should maybe have some extra bonuses. Restrained form shouldn't be such a hindrance to a lot of her cards. But still a really fun hero I do enjoy from time to time. Magneto, because you discard cards until you find a magnetic card, all those aspect cards and things you built into the deck, you can just discard past them. You cannot reliably set anything up, which means a lot of his decks just end up being Magneto doing Magneto things because he's not sure if he can set up the right things to do aspect kind of builds and all sorts of other stuff. It's kind of weird. I think he's one of the heroes with the least variety in the game, but he is fun for what he is. The Magneto experience. If you play this game a lot, you probably don't want to be playing Magneto a lot. He's not a character I'd want to play, 5 different Magneto decks back to back. I think they'd feel like fairly similar. but occasionally he is going to be really fun. Now, while he doesn't have the restrained and unleash thing, some of his cards really want there to be like the right type of encounter card out on the board in front of you, or they don't work, or they get like reduced value. So you can get a bunch of Magneto cards in hand, not have the right thing on the board, and like, oh, I wish I didn't really have all these cards here. But that is offset a lot in multiplayer, where in 4 player, 4 times the encounter cards you see in solo play, 4 times the chance to have something that your Magneto cards are going to be able to work perfectly on. So he's still fine in solo. He's a very strong hero, but he's not. He gets a lot more in multiplayer, and I think he's kind of a lot more enjoyable there. Whereas some things are, good in solo and even better in multiplayer, like Rogue. I think he's, really good in multiplayer, but kind of loses out on solo just a little bit. Before I rank the characters, I want to talk about the elephant, or the beast in the room, as it were. We didn't get a beast, of the original X-Men. I guess we got Angel not as an X-Men hero, but as X-Force. But nonetheless, at least we got Angel in the game. Beast is one of the 5 original X-Men, and we didn't get him as a hero. That is the biggest miss, I think, for the last few expansions worth of content. I have to assume they're saving him to potentially revisit the X-Men, a couple of years down the line, because it seems like crazy not to have Beast, as a hero in the game. So kind of a shame there. Especially, he's got the genius trait, which only really matters on heroes. It almost feels to me like they designed a Beast hero. The Mutant Genesis comic book, with the campaign, has Beast feature in that comic, but he's just not a hero to be found anywhere. But hopefully one day we get Beast. So yeah, I wanted to acknowledge that. I should also talk about, before I forget, the campaign in the boxes. Age of Apocalypse unfortunately has, I think, the worst campaign in all of the expansions. Now, the villains are very good, and if you play them in a sequence, is very good, but the campaign mechanics just are not fun in my opinion. They've got these side missions, and they kind of, rely on you having the right allies and getting the right resources. It's just kind of weird and feels very separate and very kind of fiddly and unnecessary, and I kind of wish it wasn't there. But Mutant Genesis has a better campaign. I'm actually not a huge fan of its campaign either, but I'm not really a campaign player in Marvel Champions. I much prefer to play them standalone. If I want to play something like a campaign, like I kind of just said with Age of Apocalypse, I'd rather just play the scenarios in order rather than put in the campaign mechanics that the books come with. To rank all the heroes, I would say I've got Bishop, Storm, Rogue, Magic, Cyclops, and Colossus at the top. And it's roughly in order. I think since I did my fun tier list, I think I've moved Magic down like slightly. Maybe Rogue moved up. It's just on any given day, I could alter these slightly. But Bishop and Storm are definitely at the top, and Rogue, I cannot imagine ever, going down too far. I love these characters. They're such fun designs. Colossus, I did almost put one tier down, but I really love Colossus. I just think he has slightly less variety, maybe, than the other characters. Slightly, a couple of bad matchups here and there. Just little things that slightly put me off him, but it's an incredibly fun hero design. If you played Colossus and bounced off him, his precon is one of the worst in the game. Changed it up immediately. If you play solo, go play him in Justice, flip Alter Ego a lot. Have a lot of fun. You steal fist against the villain, and you're in for a really great experience. Gambit I almost put up a tier. Shadowcat I almost put down a tier, but I think they both are kind of really good characters. Gambit's so interesting. I'm basically don't have a lot to add other than what I already did, but interesting in falling builds, interesting in damage builds, really interesting, at damage in general, increasing attacks, by encounters. Someone on my Discord asked what Gambit's weaknesses are, and I thought that was an interesting topic to explore a little bit. He doesn't get any sort of immediate benefits. Turn 1 in Alter Ego, you can exhaust to do something, but you're not really being given something. You're having to exhaust your character for that, and you can do that any turn. You flip form, oh, I get 1 counter as an action. That's like 1 damage point. It's very little gain early on. If the villain has steady or stalwart, his thwarting loses value, and he has to flip form to do the right thing. Some of his upgrades and things only trigger if particularly in hero form, start the sort of phase in the right form. So he loses that little bits of value here and there. I think his attack events actually aren't that efficient. I think because he can boost up their damage, they kind of like lowered their innate values, which is it's a little bit strange. But all his cards are interesting and really fun. So I really mostly have good things to say about Gambit. I think what I'm talking about here are really balanced weaknesses that, yeah, it makes sense. You can play around them and it's fine. He's probably the most balanced character on this list. Shadowcat, it's really just fun form flipping, really interesting for attacking and defending, and even thwarting's kind of interesting. But I hate that obligation. Don't like the Nemesis. Wolverine, I initially was worried he'd just be this kind of, really heavily attack-focused character, not much to him, a bit one-dimensional. And he kind of is, but the way he takes damage, the way he interacts with other cards, the way side schemes work with him, because his thwarting card tracked by scent, if you remove the last threat with it, you get lots of card draw. Um, it's just perfect in solo play for those player side schemes, and even still good at like multiplayer. Uh, he's got a lot more going for him, a lot more new attack cards. Every new attack card is really interesting for him. I love full body charge and aggression for him. So he's actually moved up my list. He almost is a tier up here. I almost put him with Gambit and Shadowcat. It was very difficult. Phoenix and Magneto got his slightly awkward bits, but are fun. Phoenix a lot more variety. Magneto a bit less, but he can wrap a minion in metal and then throw that minion. It's incredibly fun, and that alone keeps him from being any lower. He's fun when his things work. Jubilee is fine, but isn't especially amazing. Nightcrawler and Iceman, unfortunately, both. They have some really fun stuff going for them, but they just frustrate me a little bit too much. I don't ever really feel compelled to play them. I'm slightly kind of find myself almost avoiding them at the moment, I'm afraid to say. But a lot of people do like them, especially people who really appreciate, defensive protection, kind of play. So I don't want to be too mean about them, but they are definitely not heroes that suit me very well. Honestly, from Shadowcat up, I think these are some of the most fun heroes in the game. Honestly, people love Wolverine. Maybe I should have put him up kind of in the category of Shadowcat, not Phoenix and Magneto. I don't know. As it is, that's how my kind of ranking stands right now. As I said at the start of the video, I'm not going to go too much into aspect cards. I've talked in tons of videos about, what the X-Men get. Every time a new X-Men hero is coming up or I review one, I'm like, oh, look, this X-Men stuff works really well with them. Something else I want to touch on before I do that separate video on the aspects where I talk about how the mutant aspect cards have changed up the game in general. I want to talk about the Alliance cards because that's very specific to X-Men and, X-Force as well. I'm glad they revisited the concept of Alliance cards. We did have a couple here and there. We had two in the previous Next Evolution wave. But we didn't have anything that relied on two specific kind of traits, groups like X-Force and X-Men, since the Guardian and Avenger cards in, the Mad Titan Shadow Wave. And they were met with quite a lukewarm reception, and I wasn't sure they would try it again, but I hope they would. And I think this time they did a lot better. Combined Forces, it's just a little niche, a little unnecessary. 7 Protect, it exhausts the characters and, just gives tough, prevents threat, which is, it's very preventative. It's a little bit of a slow card, even if it does good things to help the table. Gunboat, Diplomacy, and Mutant Mayhem kind of give you output. They kind of let you affect things, and it's really, really fun. Gunboat Diplomacy picks an X-Men and X-Force character, exhausts them, and you add together their forwarding stats, and then you get to do that as damage and forwarding split up wherever you like. It's super flexible, really fun if you start to stack up forwarding boosts on your characters. Psylocke is the kind of poster character for this card, but you can use this on almost anyone with still good effects. Mutant Mayhem, it's kind of ally recursion, but the ally's still on the board, and you just play them again. Whip them back to hand, play them again. One X-Force, one X-Men ally, and some of the X-Men allies in the game, especially, are some of the best we have. They are very strong, very fun effects too. So being able to repeatedly play them and then yoink them back and play them again is just very, very strong and fun. And it can work well between different players at the table too if they provide them, as can Gunboat. I'm talking almost about a solo because thanks to cards like Children of the Atom and Hope Summers, which play around with gaining traits, like X-Men, X-Force, there are some ways to make these really, really solo viable. They are good solo, at least Gunboat and Mutant Mayhem. In multiplayer, they get even better, especially 7 Protect. I love that in 4-player because you can, it prevents threat being added. You can prevent the threat at the start of the villain phase being added. So if there are 4 people, and let's say 2 acceleration tokens and 1 acceleration icon side scheme out, this can prevent 7 threat, and then you're giving characters toughs. Gone through this a bit quickly, but wanted to say, generally, Gunboat Diplomacy and Mutant Mayhem are huge wins. 7 Protect, a little bit niche, but I think it's absolutely fine. I think it has its place. Combined Forces, a little bit reminiscent of the, Avenger Guardian Alliance cards, and maybe not quite good enough, but, they did something, and the other 3 I particularly like. So, yeah, overall, very pleased with this. Glad they revisited Alliance cards. I hope they do it again. So we've looked at the villains from both box and the heroes, kind of what they do, what they provide to the game, and how much I kind of like them. And if I had to rate the boxes overall, I would give it Team Age of Apocalypse. I think the villains are quite a lot better overall. I think the mod sets are phenomenal, some of the best mod sets we've ever got. And the heroes are really, really good. When me and Nelson talked about this expansion in the podcast, I was like, are these the best villains we've ever got? And he was like, are these the best heroes we've ever got? And it's just a solid box overall. Red Mutant Genesis, unfortunately, I'm a little bit down on the villains. The mod sets are, fine. But I do really like the heroes. Colossus and Shadowcat are great too. I think those are great. And the campaign is better. I think the campaign in Age of Apocalypse it's one great, Achilles heel might be the wrong word, but you get what I'm trying to say. It's one fatal flaw. the Age of Apocalypse campaign is, yeah, not so good. However, the hero packs is a bit of a different story. If you looked at the way I rated the heroes, unfortunately, looking at the Age of Apocalypse 4 hero packs, they all formed my bottom 4 heroes of the X-Men characters. So in terms of hero packs, Mutant Genesis kind of wins by default, but I actually love the hero packs from Mutant Genesis. In terms of aspect cards, I do think the Age of Apocalypse ones are generally better, except maybe the Wolverine hero pack from the Mutant Genesis packs, maybe better for aggression than Iceman. But overall, Jubilee's Justice pack is so good for the cards it gives. Nightcrawler's is extremely good for protection, and Magneto's is so interesting for leadership. It's probably one of the best out there for leadership in terms of the aspect cards it provides. In terms of heroes, it's an absolute slam dunk for the Mutant Genesis hero packs. So that's kind of where I fall on things. So let me know what you guys think. Do you disagree anywhere? What's your favorite hero pack? What's your favorite expansion box from the Mutant Trilogy? And if this video is coming out when I think it does, I've got a premiere coming up on my channel. I am revealing 2 new cards from the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. expansion box. Really excited for one of them in particular. Check that out. It should be suggested somewhere. If you can't, click on my channel. Make sure you turn on notifications for that. It's going to be really, really good. And yeah, it's good to be back. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe, like, comment, all that good stuff really helps me. And I'll see you guys next time.